never seen myself as just one thing, and I made sure no one else could either. By staying true to myself, making my own path, rising above expectations, and opening the door for others to be their true selves. The first spirit, made with VSOP Cognac, finished in bourbon casks, Martell Blue Swift, soar beyond the expected.
Good afternoon, good evening, and good night, and welcome to the Crypto and Cognac podcast show. I am 𝐂𝐎𝐍𝐈𝐎𝐍, and welcome. As always, chilling with my friends at Martell, my friends at Massy Connoisseur, and this evening I have one to finish, one to start. We're gonna have a good time because it is the night before the holiday here in Trinidad and Tobago, and we're gonna be talking something that I guess some people might see as being, a little heavy, but it's all part of the cycle of life, the cycle of existence. We're gonna be talking about I guess at this point in time, it's still the potential decline of the US dollar, more popularly known recently as de-dollarization, where many people predict that the dollar is basically going to lose its global reserve currency status based on the fact that the US economy is declining and there are up and coming challenges to their global superpower status, the number one spot, right? We've spoken about the cycle of superpowers previously, and tonight we're going to get a little bit more specific as it relates to the decline of the currency, the US dollar currency. People like Ray Dalio has done way more research into this than myself, and he basically says that currencies kind of change positions in terms of global reserve currency status every 94 years. The US dollar would have taken its position around 1920. So in the year of our Lord Satoshi, 2023, they're a little overdue to being replaced. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But before we get into that, as always, cheers, guys. I'm having me some Martell Blue Swift VSOP on the rocks. You know how we do it, always with ice, because of the ice rule. This is not financial advice, nothing that I share here today, tomorrow, last week, last year, because we've been doing this for 3 seasons, should be misconstrued as financial advice, right? It's all about information, conversation, and education, right? You sharing with me, me sharing with you, us sharing with each other, right? All love, getting to know a little bit more about this crazy financial world, but specifically with a cryptocurrency context, a blockchain context, and even more granularly with a Caribbean context. So today we're going to talk about what does de-dollarization mean for the world, what does it mean for cryptocurrency, and what does it potentially mean for us here in the Caribbean as a result of all of that. So, like I said before, Ray Dalio talks about that cycle of global reserve currency status. And if we go back maybe three cycles, France, they would have held, their currency would have held reserve currency status between 1720 to 1815. Then the British pound took over from 1815 to 1920. And then around 1920, the US dollar would have taken over as the global reserve currency. What that basically means is that this currency is the main currency in which most global trade takes place in, right? So the pound, as you guys know, has not disappeared. It's not lost all its value, of course. It's still there, still very much one of the strongest currencies in the world, but has lost its legging as the global reserve currency to the US dollar. So even as we talk about de-dollarization and we talk about the US dollar potentially losing its stranglehold as the global reserve currency, this does not mean that we expect that the dollar is gonna, go to zero and have no value and just disappear from existence. That's not practical in the, I would say, short to medium term, maybe even in the near long term. I don't see that as being plausible. But we're gonna look at some considerations around how the US dollar has gotten on over the years, over the last century, and potentially what we see happening going forward. So, even though we talk about the dollar becoming or garnering reserve currency status since 1920, a lot of people attribute one particular event to really solidifying the US dollar as the global reserve currency, and that can be attributed back to the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, where 44 countries gathered together and a decision was taken that the US dollar would be the global reserve currency. The US dollar would be backed by gold and other natural resources, other commodities, and most other dollars would then be pegged to the US dollar, right? So that happened in 1944. In 1945, another significant incident or another significant agreement kind of solidified the US dollar's stranglehold on the global economy and really put it in that rare air of being the global reserve currency. And that was when President, I think it's Roosevelt. Do I have it here in my notes? All right. I think it's President Roosevelt. He would have made a deal with the then King of Saudi Arabia, agreeing that the US would support and back Saudi Arabia and protect Saudi Arabia in all instances if the US dollar was made to be the currency that all oil transactions are made in, right? And, we could have a whole discourse. Somebody could write, and I'm sure people have written numerous dissertations on how the US has stood by that particular promise, how every single US president since then has courted the Saudi royal family, has supported them in whatever instance they needed it. And as a result of that, the US has continued to receive favor around the use of the US dollar in all oil transactions. But something happened in 1971 that I think, if you really look at or trace the decline of prominence of the US dollar, was where President Richard Nixon made the decision to temporarily remove the gold backing of US dollars, right? And I'm not going to try to paraphrase what he said. I'm going to share his comments with you directly as he addressed the US people and the people of the world.
7 years, there's been an average of one international.
Let's go back to the beginning.
We must protect the position of the American dollar as a pillar of monetary stability around the world. In the past 7 years, there's been an average of one international monetary crisis every year. Now, who gains from these crises? Not the working man, not the investor, not the real producers of wealth. The gainers are the international money speculators. Because they thrive on crises, they help to create them. In recent weeks, the speculators have been waging an all-out war on the American dollar. The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States. Now, what is this action, which is very technical, what does it mean for you? Let me lay to rest the bugaboo of what is called devaluation. If you want to buy a foreign car or take a trip abroad, market conditions may cause your dollar to buy slightly less. But if you are among the overwhelming majority of Americans who buy American-made products in America, your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today. The effect of this action, in other words, will be to stabilize the dollar. Now, this action will not win us any friends among the international money traders. But our primary concern is with the American workers and with fair competition around the world. To our friends abroad, including the many responsible members of the international banking community who are dedicated to stability in the flow of trade, I give this assurance. The United States has always been and will continue to be a forward-looking and trustworthy trading partner.
So yeah, that was President Nixon, 1971. And I think two things that he mentioned there in terms of what that removal of the gold backing and how it would impact the US and the world by extension. I think two of those points really need to be pulled out to give context to the environment that we are in now in 2023 as compared to 1971 when that decision was taken. So he made the point that if you're an American and you're earning US dollars and you are buying US manufactured goods in the US, then this will not affect you, right? Basically, the devaluation of the US dollar, or in other words, inflation, would not affect you. Now, in 1971, when he would have made that statement, the US manufacturing sector accounted for almost 20 million jobs, right? And the US manufacturing sector accounted for about 28% of all global manufacturing. So the US was in the dominant position as a global manufacturing superpower in 1971. So the impact and the fallout from the devaluation or the perceived devaluation of their dollar overseas would not have been significant. Now, fast forward 50 years later, what we see is that manufacturing jobs have declined significantly and steadily over time, down from near 20 million to just about 12 million manufacturing jobs. Worse conditions, worse standard of living for people working in the manufacturing industry. And now US manufacturing only accounts for 16% of global manufacturing, right? Now, it seems obvious. We know almost everything nowadays is made in China, right? And it may feel to people like myself, people younger than myself, that it has always been that way, right? Because as far as we've known, China, everything was made in China. But for context, back in 1971, China accounted for 2 to 3% of global manufacturing, of the global manufacturing sector, right? 2 to 3%. Fast forward to 2023, China is now the world's leading manufacturer, accounting for almost 30% of global manufacturing, right? And while that, so between 2 and 3% to 30%, that's 27%. Whereas that did not all come from the US, because the US only lost about 12%. It has come from a lot of US allies. So the environment then is significantly, it's significantly different to today. As we talk about that difference to China as it relates to US allies, we want to also look at some of the competing currencies and competing interests as it relates to this global reserve currency and global economic superpower conversation, right? What we are seeing is that the US has already lost its dominance, right? Even though 60% of all currency in the world, existing in the world right now, is held in US dollars. US dollars account for 60% of all global currency, right? But that has significantly declined. In addition to that, we're seeing new challenges to the economic supremacy of the US and its allies, right? The BRICS contingent, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, right? These emerging economies pact or bloc, it's an economic alliance. They just surpassed the G7 in terms of share of global GDP, right? So the G7, which is, the US, the UK, France, Germany. Who else in there? Let me confirm with my notes. Canada, Italy, and Japan, and by extension, the EU, make up the G7, right? But they now account for about 30.5% of global GDP, whereas the BRICS cohort now account for 31.5% of global GDP. So these emerging economies have seemingly emerged, right? So what we're seeing is that the US's position of economic dominance and the economic dominance of its allies has already been supplanted. It's already been overtaken, right? And in addition to that, we have seen recently some of these countries, some of these other global superpowers who may not be as large as the US. I think what we've seen is that a lot of them have kind of taken stock of what is happening around the world, and we could trace it back, I would say, with the velocity of what is happening, could probably be traced back to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, what we saw coming out of that conflict is the global police, led by the US, have placed significant economic sanctions on Russia, right? And I think for the first time, like, the US has always used economic sanctions, and the UN has always used economic sanctions to drive their influence in the world, but it's always been relatively small nations. So Cuba, we know for a long time, people like Venezuela, countries in Africa, countries in the Middle East. But I think this was the first time within recent time where people saw the US flex their economic muscle and their economic currency influence on a major player. How was this done? So you hear people talk about US debt, the US debt ceiling being raised to over $30 trillion. And that debt is basically held by numerous countries around the world, numerous institutions around the world, in the form of US Treasury, right? So countries buy US debt with the expectation and the understanding that the US is going to be very responsible and repay their debts. And it's a it has traditionally been a very, very safe store of value for any surpluses. Now, that money has to be held in what is normally referred to as a currency wallet. And as a result of their invasion of Ukraine, Russia saw the threat of their currency wallet being seized and the funds held in that currency wallet being used to support Ukraine. So I think that for Russia in particular was a terrifying idea. And I think some of the other countries around the world, some of the other superpowers around the world kind of took a step back and started thinking, yo, what if we do something that the US is not in agreement with? How will they use their influence, their currency influence, to penalize us, to prevent us from being able to access trade, to prevent us from being able to access resources? And yes, that might now be aligned with a violent military conflict, as in the case of Russia, which we do not support. But I think people are just thinking, you know, where does the line start and end as relates to not being aligned with US policy, and what will be, or what could be, the potential repercussions for not being aligned with those policies. So I think coming out of that, we started seeing more and more activities around countries wanting to do trade in their own currency. And as very early in 2021 or 2022, we saw Russia offering to sell their oil to India, to China, in their own currency. And what we saw is that the Russian ruble, took off in terms of its strengthening. I think getting to a 7-year high at one point in time against the dollar, because of this trade of its natural resources in its own currency. But outside of that, we're seeing, for example, the BRICS grouping working on building their own currency to start trading. We're seeing China making agreements. They recently made an agreement with Brazil to trade natural gas in their own currencies. A recent agreement with Iran to trade oil in yuan as well. So we are seeing more and more the intention to move away from dollar dependency. And I think while US leadership is very speaking openly and publicly very positively about the strength of the US dollar, this must be terrifying to them, because as we said, the US's strength and the strength of the dollar has been aligned to the fact that, one, US's military might, two, US's economic might, and their relationship with Saudi Arabia to have all oil and gas transactions transacted in US dollars. So should that, for whatever reason, be removed, that could be a very terrifying experience for the US as it relates to the security of their currency, especially as they continue to raise their debt ceiling, right? Now, how attractive do US treasuries continue to become or continue to be when more and more countries start trading in their own currencies, right? Is the US able to continue to print money out of thin air and export their debt globally as they've been able to do over the last 50 years, right? And we're also seeing China, who I think is the most aggressive challenger to the US's dominance. We're seeing them moving across the world, building alliances in a way that is very different to the way that the US has done it over the last few decades. I think, we see them recently negotiating. They've been the ones kind of negotiating potential peace deals between Ukraine and Russia. They have recently, up to today or yesterday, gotten the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia and Iran, who have for years been bitter enemies, to meet and potentially start trashing out some peace. They have been the ones kind of waving the flag of peace across the world and have been providing economic support for a lot of countries in a way that is a lot more supportive to those countries' economies than, for example, the IMF and World Bank. So, for example, a lot of what they've done in Africa has been to offer way better terms to these countries than they would have gotten from the IMF or the World Bank. Not saying that China is not doing this to receive a benefit. Clearly, they are seeking a benefit, but it feels like they are going about it in a way more mutually beneficial way than the US. So we if we had to put a title to how the US has gone about exerting their economic power and their military power over the world. They've pretty much taken the stick approach, right? We could probably call the book of US Global Supremacy the Art of War, if we had to put a book title to it. And in comparison, we've seen China kind of using the alternative approach. They're using the carrot approach, and we might call their book, how to win friends and influence people. Yeah, I think that's the name of the book. But it just seems so day and night. Maybe because of the times, maybe because of social media, maybe because they've looked and seen how the world has responded to that almost tyrannical way of exerting dominance, and they've chosen to do it a different way. So how is that now changing the way that China is even perceived in the global landscape? And we're seeing it. We're seeing a lot of African leaders come out and speak glowingly about China, glowingly about Russia, and very different to what we hear in Western media as it relates to those two nations, and pushing back at what they consider tyrannical exertion by the US over decades. A lot more people talking about all the coups that the US government has been involved in, all the people they have backed as it relates to these coups since 1970 something to now. And we have very, very interesting times ahead. And like I said, I don't think that we're going to just wake up one morning and the US dollar is going to disappear out of existence, and all of a sudden we're going to be doing all kind of trades in yuan, and we're going to be going to the banks and asking for yuan instead of US dollars. But I think what we're going to see is definitely a move away from the dependency on the US dollar. And what does this mean for cryptocurrency and crypto in general? And I think especially as the US continues to exert adversarial pressure on the crypto economy and the crypto industry, I think having safe havens in other countries is going to be beneficial for the crypto industry. And maybe this challenge to the US dollar may cause the US to say, you know what, let's not engage in a war with everybody all at once. And you might see the US start adopting and being more welcoming to this new innovation, this new technology, because I would say it is more beneficial to them to support an industry where cryptocurrencies are backed by US dollars as compared to pushing crypto companies and the crypto industry into the arms of other countries and other currencies. And now the whole crypto industry is now backed by yuan or the ruble or this new BRICS currency. I don't see that as being beneficial to the US dollar. So hopefully, we see a wake-up call and they change their overall outlook towards the industry. For us here in the Caribbean, people like Trinidad and Tobago specifically, whose currency is directly pegged to the US dollar, we will have to watch it very, very carefully to see whether or not continuing that direct peg is going to be in our benefit. Fortunately, we are an oil and gas producer, so even if there are changes around there, we might be able to pivot. What we've seen even in recent times is that the oil producing groups, OPEC, slashing production in direct opposition to requests by the US and its allies, driving up oil prices in an environment where suppliers are already reduced because Russia has been kind of taken out of the supply chain for Europe, particularly because of these sanctions. But how does that impact, other Caribbean countries who depend on US dollars and foreign currency to support their economy through tourism? What does the weakening of the US dollar do in terms of US citizens traveling to the Caribbean for all their recreational activity? We will have to wait and see. Do Americans start buying local, supporting local, traveling locally? How does the potential fallout all come together? But from where I sit, I don't see it happening all at once, though many Bitcoin supporters speculate that we're gonna have some big black swan event that is gonna cause a significant de-dollarization, a super Bitcoinization, where we see a lot of people rush to Bitcoin as a reserve currency. We are seeing that the Fed is developing their FedNow digital currency, a CBDC. How will that impact people's ability to be able to move from the fiat space into the digital crypto space? How is that FedNow dollar digital currency gonna allow for people to move from the US dollar to other currencies like the yuan and the ruble? Is this a outright offensive against the potential for people to move out of the US dollar? What type of controls are they going to implement with this CBDC? As we've talked about many times before here, a CBDC basically gives them almost absolute control over what you are able to do with your money, whether it be programming it so that you can only buy certain goods, maybe only buy from certain suppliers, and maybe even being able to extract taxes at a moment's notice, or maybe even going so far as to blacklist it in your wallet so that if you fall out of line with what they approve of. So that is something that we have to continue to look out for. But with all that said, we are seeing a reduction in the controls, the dominance of the US dollar globally. This is likely just the beginning, though people have been talking about de-dollarization as far back as the 1970s, right, when they got off the gold standard. And every decade since then, people have been talking about it. Is this the moment in time? We don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But I think it is really, really likely, with everything that we've talked about today, from China's ascension as a manufacturing superpower, China's ascension as a global superpower, the BRICS ascension as a dominant economic bloc, surpassing the G7, the relationships that China is building across the world, making friends, being the beacon of peace around the world, which, you know, we never thought that we would see that. Like, we're seeing pictures of the Saudi foreign minister and the Iranian foreign minister shaking hands, and in the midst of them is the Chinese foreign minister, and in the background the Chinese national flag, which in a place where we would usually expect to see the US flag. So it's definitely a new day, guys. But we got to stay alert. As I said, not financial advice, but for me, I would think that now especially you would want to be taking a very, very close look at how you secure your wealth, how you store your wealth, which currencies you look at, how you diversify your savings, not just in terms of instruments, but maybe even in currencies. Maybe start looking at what investments are out there that allow you to save in different currencies, whether it be, you know, US dollars, yuan, yen, pounds, as the case may be, because we're in very strange times, you know, and we don't know what the future holds. But I'm gonna be here every single Thursday, 7 p.m., getting you the information. As I get it, as I interpret it, I'm going to bring it to you. But as always, you have to do your part, do your own research. I am not an expert on any of these things. I am not a financial advisor. I am not an economist. I am not a currency expert. I am not a lawyer. So do your own research. I'm going to put a few different links in the description so you guys could check some of the different resources that I checked on for all this information. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you guys again next week. And as always, thank you guys for being with me. It's always a pleasure to be here with you guys, to share a drink with you guys, to have a conversation with you guys. You know what I believe as it relates to cryptocurrency, as it relates to blockchain technology, as it relates to the future of finance, adoption is inevitable. Illuminati out, guys. Be blessed. Enjoy your long weekend if you're in Trinidad and Tobago, anywhere that there's a holiday this week. Be safe on the roads. Protect yourself. Be good. Illuminati out. Bless.